The first few times that I tried to write a book from scratch, I always got stuck somewhere in the middle, or I didn't feel like it had any momentum carrying me forward. And I started to read all these books about plotting and all the different systems about how to organize and structure a story. But it didn't really click for me until I rearranged my own system, which I call the plot dot. And it's been a while. Now I've written over 20 books, and I thought I'd go back and go through this 8 point story plotting template because I do think it's the easiest way to think about how to tell a story, whether you're writing a fiction or a memoir or any other kind of organized narrative where you're trying to get somewhere and have a satisfying resolution. It does help to have a little bit of structure. So in this video, I'm going to go through the original plot dot, and I'm going to give you some other resources, and then we're going to also peek at the 24 chapter plot outline, which is a lot more advanced. But once you've got this down, you might be ready for something a little bit more robust. So stay tuned for that, and let's dive into part one. So actually, quick disclaimer. I wrote an article for NaNoWriMo a while ago. I'm kind of a big NaNoWriMo proponent. I don't always do it, but it has helped me to get a few books done. I've finished almost 20 novels now, and I've rented, I think, 4 or 5 castles for NaNoWriMo. So I've been featured on their website a few times. But they had to update my article where I laid out this plot dot structure, because here I say the essential scenes for every story, and someone was pointing out that this is really a Western approach to narrative based on Joseph Campbell's reduction of foreign cultures by trying to fit everything to this specific template. And that is kind of true, but it's also kind of true that the majority of commercial novels that get bought and sold and read generally have some kind of a structure to them. And that template is always going to depend a little bit on the readership, the audience, and the genre. But this really does work for most commercial genres. So you could always be writing some other non-standard, non-narrative type of book, and that's fine. Maybe you don't need any structure. You might also say, I don't like plotting, I don't like structure because I'm a pantser, and that's also fine. I find that even if I really plot out my story, when you're actually drafting, when you're doing your writing sprints and you're putting the words on the page, a lot of that is discovery anyway. You never really know exactly how it's all going to unfold. And I'll also point out that none of these things tell you what to do with your story. None of these are, the protagonist should do this thing. It's not that specific. These are just very general turning points to make sure you are going somewhere. Every story really needs to focus on dramatic conflict, and the way to unpackage a story with a lot of tension and suspense, which is a whole different video. I've got a lot of videos on YouTube you can check out about writing and craft. But really simply, you always want to have the potential for conflict without resolving and taking away that drama. So whenever you over-explain or you give too much detail, you're not raising the story questions. Readers aren't wondering what's going to happen next, or I wonder what's going to happen with this thing. So you want to present a lot of potential conflict, but keep the balls in the air for as long as possible without catching them. Because once you catch and close the story thread, once you give answers and satisfaction resolution, then there's no tension and suspense. That's kind of a different thing, but it really is important to hit these general turning points so that from the beginning to the end, the story feels like you built it on purpose, and that it makes sense to the readers, and that it ends up being satisfying. What I've seen as sort of a anecdotal story about writing, a lot of pantsers, I feel like maybe pantsers are better writers because they intuitively focus on a lot of suspense and drama and intrigue. But I also feel like pantsers, maybe it's very exciting to read, but it doesn't quite get you to that very satisfying end where everything wraps up really, really nicely. So it's not exactly a quality thing. I don't like to judge quality. It depends on the readership and what they're looking for. There's no such thing as like necessarily a better book or a better written book. It's always about what readers are responding to. But from the standpoint of someone who's written a lot of novels, and it's always a huge struggle to finish, I do find that if you've been having trouble finishing the story that you're working on, or maybe you've started a lot of projects but you've never really been able to finish them, or you get bored. Often it's because you get stuck somewhere in the middle, and that's something that my plotting structures will help you with. Or maybe after you've gotten your rough draft, you can't ever edit it into something that's really polished and publishable. And that's another step where you could go back after the fact and try to fix your rough draft by making sure you hit all these story points. But it's generally easier to just plan it out in the beginning so that you can make sure your story. I like to use the word momentum, and I see this as sort of like a wheel that's generating energy, because every this is like 25% to get to the first plot point, second plot point, 75%. So every 12% or so, you hit one major exciting incident, which really changes the stakes and the flow of the novel. If you aren't hitting those incidents, you might just have tons of backstory, or you might have tons of ordinary world, or a lot of dialogue and stuff where it's not really going anywhere. And every chapter has to do all of the work of holding the reader's interest, but also every chapter might kind of feel the same. You don't want to have the same number or the same amount of conflict and drama and intrigue in every chapter, because you always want to be going somewhere new. You always want to be taking the story in a new direction. That's why these are really valuable. So the ordinary world, usually the first couple of chapters is your opportunity to show the protagonist in whatever their status quo is. If it's a fantasy world or whatever, this is where you could be doing some world building. But you want to start with an ordinary day. You don't want to start with like the protagonist sitting and thinking back about their key backstory stuff that happened a long time ago. Try to pick where your real story is going to begin. Leading up to, the final battle or crisis of whatever the thing is. Start as close to that as possible. Think about the chain of events that will get you to that conclusion. And then think of a day that's not an ordinary boring day, like they're just sitting around doing nothing. Usually I like to focus on a very important day where things go wrong. So an ordinary world, you'll see like in young adult fantasy, there's a lot of like choosing ceremonies, and it's right before the protagonist is going to go through this major life-changing thing that they've been dreaming about or thinking about for a really long time. In romance or something like contemporary, it could just be they've been exciting about graduating or moving out or moving to a new country or whatever it is. They're on the precipice of something new, and often they have a lot of expectations and hopes, so it's pretty positive. But there might be a lot of low-key distractions. You want things to be happening, so maybe you also want to be I know this is a lot for one video, but you want your characters to be likable, especially in the first chapter. And the easy way to do that is have them taking care of someone else or being nice to someone else. So maybe they're taking care of their elderly neighbor or their parents or their sibling or even like a pet or something. You just show them being kind, to strangers. So even like a little coffee shop incident where you also can get readers to like your protagonist by having bad things happen to them, like they spill coffee on themselves and then they make friends with an interesting stranger. There's a little bit of banter, whatever. Ordinary world is just, it doesn't mean nothing is happening. You want things to be happening, just low key stakes that reveal character attributes and personality in a way that makes your protagonist likable. And they start with a lack here. You don't have to really think about your character's fatal flaw or shard of glass. You can Google those terms if you're not familiar with them. But most protagonists will have some hole inside themselves that gets repaired through the telling of the story. The specific hole that you choose will depend on the story that you're telling. And ideally, in the middle of the final battle scene, they will finally have all the experience and information that they need to finally start repairing that hole by making a different choice than they've made previously. So you might, without like over developing it, you might have an idea of what their fatal flaw or shard of glass is. But even on just a more basic sense, start with a lack means you don't want to start with like a billionaire protagonist who is very successful and happy and has everything that they need, and they're completely okay and at peace with the world unless you take that all away from them immediately in the next chapter. But more commonly, if you start with lack, like I mentioned, it'd be like, and a very important day where your protagonist thinks they are about to change their lives. You want to show them in most, Netflix TV shows, movies, or whatever. People root for an underdog. It's generally somebody who um, has a lot of people counting on them, maybe doesn't have a lot of money or opportunity or power, and they are about to do something that they've either been planning for a long time or resisting for a long time, but they're about to finally make a choice that'll, make them more successful, whether that means in love or career or whatever. And I do think the thing that they try to do first should probably fail. Probably they have like a reasonable goal where they think it's going to solve all their problems. And that's what the first couple chapters is all about. And then a major, major setback where they do not get that thing that they were expecting. And it forces them into a new path, because you kind of want your characters to make crazy decisions, but smart characters won't make crazy decisions unless they're desperate. So, and you probably don't want to show, like, you can't just start off with an absolutely desperate character because you haven't shown the ordinary world yet. So I like to have a little bit of, they're hoping for something that does not pan out. There's a trivial series of negative events that push them into an extreme level of desperation. And that's important because when we get to the call to adventure or the point of no return, that initial failure is going to become important. So I'm going to move on to these kind of slowly, but that's actually what I would do. People get confused because, the ordinary world to the inciting incident, which is like 12.5. I like to have all my chapters around 2,000 words. So if you have a 60, 70,000 word novel, you might have around 24 chapters, which is why I like my 24 chapter plot outline. These are only 8 chapters or 8 points. So you're going to need about 3 chapters for each of these things, which is why the ordinary world, they're expecting the big thing. They have, the lead up to the big thing, and then the big thing doesn't work out. And then they have a bunch of little events that push them further into, what am I going to do next? A little bit of desperation so that when this inciting incident happens, they notice it. The inciting incident or the call to adventure is when they get the awareness that there's something else going on. In a fantasy, this would be like their peek behind the curtain, something magical, something different. They probably ignore it at first. It doesn't quite fit into their worldview. They're not eager to just go off on the path of adventure. They have their own plans. They have their own path set out for them. This is a distraction they don't like. In a romance, this would be like the cute hot guy who's kind of a jerk or an asshole, a little incident, but they push it away. They're not looking for romance, and especially not with that guy. So this inciting incident is something unexpected that doesn't quite fit into their worldview, but is noticeable because it stands out, because it's really something unusual that isn't a part of the normal, ordinary world. This is also a way to define what's normal and what's ordinary. You don't want to get like too deep into explaining your world, but this will stand out because it's different from what's expected. So having your characters react to this or talk this over with their friends or whatever, respond to it, shows them what they're expecting and what doesn't fit in this world. A lot of people will say refusal of the call. That's pretty common in other writing systems. So when they have this call to adventure, it could be even, Harry Potter's letter to come attend Hogwarts. Not only is it the invitation, it's also, you're a wizard, Harry. It's the first thing. If you're familiar with Harry Potter, all those letters get rejected. His family really doesn't want him to know he's a wizard. Hagrid eventually has to come and break down the door, and there's a big magical episode. So the whole, building up to that inciting incident, he's not actively pursuing adventure. He's unraveling his core identity at the same time. There's a lot going on here. And in most cases, you don't ever really want the hero to embrace the call to adventure. You want them to be forced onto a path of no return, which is kind of the first plot point. So even here, maybe they accept because they're absolutely desperate. You take away every other option that is smart and reasonable and safe, and you force them on this, crazy lottery ticket of the unknown, because normal smart characters don't just jump into the unknown without, you have to establish their need, you have to establish what they need and what they want, what they lack, so they have some motivation, and then you have to take away every other option so that finally they are forced on the path. And then even when you get here to the first plot point, it's often not a deliberate decision. They may still be refusing, and then they're kidnapped, or their village is attacked, or the antagonist forces interrupt their normal ordinary world, and now they have no other options but to do something different that they didn't really choose to. So that choosing, that decision, that's really important. We'll talk more about that later at the midpoint. And also, I mentioned antagonists. This one doesn't really focus on antagonists, because in my 24 chapter plot outline, I do go into, the interior and the external conflict and the forces. But real quick, the battle scenes are going to be here. First pinch point is the first battle, second pinch point is the second battle, and then the final battle is here. So throughout this process, they're also figuring out who or what the antagonist is, what's the opposition. There's a lot of understanding and information that can be parsed out later, but is always going to be a process of discovery. And you don't want them to find out too much too early. Generally, what happens at this point of no return is that's when they go to the magical world, if you're writing a fantasy, or the sci-fi world or adventure, whatever the mission is that they're going to try to do this thing. Often the mission that they're attempting is not to stop the antagonist or defeat the bad guys. That might not be on their radar yet. They may have an inkling, like in this inciting incident, sometimes in something like Shadowhunters, I think, the first inciting incident is she goes into a club and she's able to see the supernatural stuff. So she sees the demons and the shadow hunters fighting, and nobody else can see them. But she doesn't know what any of that means yet. She just sees something she can't explain that's supernatural. So she is witnessing the antagonist forces, but has no contextual awareness of that yet. Here, the first plot point, when she goes into that new world, in these few chapters, there will be some like discovery of the terms, like, okay, now we left the ordinary world, now we're in the new world or the magical world or whatever the new platform is, that the mission or the remainder of the story is going to take place in. And that's where you can start, like, now you've built the conflict and some exciting things have happened. Now you can start to explain a few things. And this is probably by having the mentor or the new friend or somebody who takes them under their wing, who understands what's going on, and maybe slowly teaches them some stuff about the stakes. What is this world? Who are the good guys and the bad guys? What are they fighting about? What are the issues? And then finally, you'll get to this first pinch point battle, where it's the first real exposure to a larger field of conflict, not between the main antagonist, but probably the antagonist forces. If you're writing a romance or contemporary or something that isn't magical, you'd get up through this point, you'd start the new thing that is not expected and not necessarily wanted, and then that new thing, in the context of the new situation that the protagonist finds themselves in, there will be one huge point of conflict or one major setback. So they've barely started on this brand new path, which again is the only path left to them, and they are desperate and they have to succeed no matter what. And then they're going to have a major setback, and that's going to bring us, after a few more chapters, to the midpoint, which is the shift from victim to warrior. So up until the midpoint, they may not really want to be on this path. They're desperate, but they don't like this situation. They don't actually want to be a part of this world or feel like they're a part of this world. In a romance example, maybe they start a new job. Maybe they're working for their billionaire boss or whatever, and they don't really think they belong here. They don't really think that they want it. Maybe they have attraction to somebody, but they're pushing it away. They're not open to that yet. But this major conflict forces them to reflect. And for the first time, really, they are now considering, do they actually still want what they wanted before? Are they still trying to get back to this ordinary world, which maybe they are even in fantasy? Maybe they just want to go home again. The whole context of tapping the red shoes in The Wizard of Oz, she's just trying to get home to Kansas, but after she's met all these new characters and they're all trying to get their thing that they want, and she's actually just trying to get home, she's also starting to think at this point, she has friends here now. She likes this magical world. The Wizard of Oz is a bad guy, maybe. She slowly starts to feel like there might be more that's worth fighting for than her own personal desires and gratification, which is generally the case for most successful stories, especially in commercial fiction. You have at the beginning a selfish, even if they're very nice and they're just trying to take care of people, there's generally a shift from a normal person who's just trying to take care of the people that they care about, and a hero or a warrior who is brave enough and willing to fight for the world, to fight for peace or harmony or defeating the bad guys, like larger scale, big picture battles, which are not their battles to fight, but at this point they may realize they have a unique skill or gift or position, and maybe they are thinking about fighting for belonging or acceptance, or maybe they have friends now that they feel responsible to. There's a point of belonging where some of this was just fighting for approval and belonging, and now they kind of feel like maybe they do belong here, maybe this is their world, maybe this is their fight, and they have to deliberately decide to stop reacting to everything which has been happening in the first half and actually proactively start to do things. This will often look like the protagonist getting a special role. So maybe they are offered a more permanent chance or a more special place or role, could be depending on their skills or abilities, maybe because they've proven themselves and people respect or rely on them. So maybe they're offered a chance to commit to something, and that'll usually lead to the second pinch point or second battle. So maybe this is a mission. Something happened here. Now they have to reflect and think about things, and there's a good chance for like character depth and relationship building. And then they decide to go and do something, whether or not it's directly tied to thwarting the antagonist or stopping their nemesis or whatever. Probably it's not. I don't think they should go in, let's just go attack the antagonist. That's usually not what they're going to do. They're going to look for some weak point, or maybe there's someone they have to go and save and rescue. Maybe somebody got captured here that they have to go and save. So they will formulate a plan. The protagonist will be given a very key role, and they'll have to decide to say yes and accept the new role, which will lead to the second battle, which is the plan, which is, probably it's not like let's go to war. It's more like let's try to avoid conflict by doing this super sneaky thing, but then they get caught and then they have to fight their way out. So this conflict is not sought after. They're not violent. They're not seeking confrontation. They are trying to do something and they get thwarted. So even if this is just, maybe in a contemporary, they want to be a comedian or a singer, or they want to make peace with their father or whatever, they're deciding to take action and they go into that situation hoping for the best. And then things go terribly wrong and they barely escape with their lives. And there's some kind of a loss, which leads us to the second plot point, which is the dark night of the soul. This is where I really got stuck when I was writing my first few novels, because I couldn't quite figure out, between the final battle scenes. I think the thing was, if you have a final battle scene, does the dark night of the soul come after the final battle scene or before? But why would it come before when nothing really bad has happened yet? There's got to be, I think, a major battle scene where they fail, a dark night of the soul where they were not yet prepared for the level or the stakes. There was something unexpected. This is usually due to a personal failure where the protagonist feels responsible because they screwed up. Either they weren't brave enough, or they weren't strong enough, or they just had a bad plan and they didn't think things through, but for whatever reason, there's some personal responsibility. So, and something bad enough should happen, whether a character dies or someone gets really injured, something bad happens where the character feels responsible. They couldn't feel responsible in the first half because they weren't choosing to take action, but now they are choosing to take action and they go into it willingly. Now there's personal responsibility, which is what the Dark Knight of the Soul is all about. The protagonist probably now feels like this fight is too big. I'm not cut out for this. I'm the wrong person. People were relying on me and I let them down. That's what's happening here. And probably there's a scene where someone else, there's something called the girding of the loins, where someone else kind of talks them into, this isn't your fight. We have to try again. And they are resistant to put themselves into even more danger so that more people can get hurt. But there has to be some version, just like this was a turning point from victim to warrior. This is also sort of a turning point from, they're super upset and depressed and afraid and doubting everything, but they have to get past that to try again, to do one more thing, to persevere, whatever it is, leading into another battle where they're going to try to do something else, something different. Probably something bad happened here. Maybe here's where they met the antagonist for the first time. The villain reveals himself. I also somewhere say that you don't really want to show the villain's face. And even when you do, like when at the midpoint, you might think you know who the villain or what the problem is or the thing that you need to do, but that's probably flawed information. And so here at the Dark Knight of the Soul, there's probably also some big reveal or change or shift that happens here. So there's new realization about the forces of the antagonist or the main villain's agenda or what they want, or maybe the protagonist's link or association with the villain that makes them kind of rethink everything. So there's a lot of stuff to unpack, but eventually you'll get to another final battle. And I have a whole other video series, I think, on just the final battle, because you can really unpack the final battle a lot. Real quick, the things I like to do in a final battle are an inside and outside battle. So you have the forces, the friendly forces who are out there fighting with the antagonist forces, which is like a real big battle in sci-fi or fantasy. And then you have the private battle that's just the protagonist and the antagonist basically one-on-one fighting things on a smaller scale. And everybody else is, desperately slow motion, fighting, dying, losing, trying to buy just enough time for the protagonist to finally defeat the antagonist, or at least just do the thing that they were supposed to do. Maybe they have to flip the switch and open the door or whatever. But everybody's waiting and counting on the protagonist to do the final thing. It's a big stretch. Usually time slows down. And there's this pinnacle moment where there's a point of realization. And this is the best place for a full backstory flashback. You've probably alluded to the fatal flaw or the shard of glass or the backstory why is this particular mission and this particular challenge impossible for the protagonist? They may not know yet. It's probably associated with the thing that they fear the most, or they're most afraid of, or they're most unwilling to give up. Maybe the thing that they want or desire most that they still think they're fighting for and they still think they can have. There's this point here where they shift and they become selfless and they give up even the hope that they will survive the encounter. And they're willing to, give it all. So this is kind of a point where the villain is probably gloating. The villain is winning. The protagonist is not strong enough. And then they, somehow unlikely discover a new weapon or a new power or a new realization that allows them to have the strength to finally push forward that last 1% and do the thing and defeat the villain. So this final battle scene, it can last several chapters and be built out that way. So that's basically the structure for the plot dot. Something I came up with, many years ago that's helped me write a lot of books and also helped a lot of people write a lot of books because I know a lot of people are using this. Real quick, I'll show you. I've actually put it up on Amazon. It's free. You can get it Plot Dot up on Amazon, and you can find it. It's free in the US store. It's not exactly a book, though. It's not a thick book like this. It's basically, I've got the same content on creativeindie.com, so you can find most of it there. The idea behind it is more as a coloring book, because the main point I was trying to make in the Plot Dot is also about visualizing your scenes. So it's helpful to have turning points, and that will help you to map out and outline your novel. But in terms of writing scene description and how you choose where the action is, it's also really helpful to think of everything in terms of a movie or a screenplay. So you should be able to draw your pivotal key scenes and visualize how they look. Because if you can't visualize how they look, it's possible there's too much stuff going on that's either narrative backstory, where it's really just the narrator, on the screen talking about what the characters are doing instead of the characters actually doing things, or it might be too much internal dialogue or internal thinking, where unless your main character is, stopping and doing a soliloquy on the stage, which always interrupts the action. Anytime the author or the narrator is talking directly to readers, or the protagonist is thinking things through too much. And yes, you do want that to happen, especially later in key dramatic scenes. You don't really want so much of that in the first few chapters, because you want your action to keep going. So the way that the Plot Dot helps you to visualize your scenes will also really help in terms of show, don't tell. If you've ever heard that but aren't really sure what that means, I do have some other videos and resources on show, don't tell. But one simple way to do it is just to pick, okay, these 8 are my main pivotal scenes. Can I draw what that looks like as a picture? Can I at least figure out how it's all going to work together and what I'm looking at? That'll help you to get rid of some of that telling stuff where you're just talking at the reader, but nothing is really happening. You always want things to play out as if you're watching a movie or TV screen. There is the argument that, narrative fiction is different from movies. The reason that books are different is because you get the interior monologue and you can see what characters are thinking. That's also true. But you do want to balance that with things that are happening, that you want the action to be moving forward. You want the time to be moving. You don't want to pause time and just be like throwing words at your readers. I do have some more details down here too about how to structure each act of your story with some story questions, to build likable characters and make sure your characters want something and that's driving the motivation of the story forward. I also have some prompts in terms of thinking about your main characters and plotting them out. On creativeindie.com, I've got a bunch of stuff on character development cheat sheets, and that's really useful too for making more developed round characters. And I also have developed a pretty robust 24-chapter plot outline. That's also really popular, but you probably need to start with the Plot Dot to understand the 8 turning points first, because then the rest of it will make sense, because these 8 points in red, those are the Plot Dot, and everything else in between shows you what can kind of happen for every chapter. I mentioned that there should be about 3 chapters for every section, so these two really go together. And again, this isn't really telling you what to do in your story. This is sort of just a marker of roughly where you might want to be as your story progresses. You can either use it for editing to make sure you've got a really strong structure, or you can map your story out first so that when you start to, pants or draft your actual content, you'll have a rough idea of where you're going, which I think is really useful. If you need some extra help, I do have some writing courses. I think I've got links way down here somewhere. I've mentioned like the best writing and software. I also have a lot of YouTube videos that go really deep into all this stuff. So I would recommend checking out my other videos. Links to, I've got this whole thing as a template that you can download for Scrivener, Plotter, OpenOffice, MS Word. You basically just open the Microsoft document, and I've already got those 24-chapter outlines plotted for you, so you can just add in your content. That'll save you a little bit of time. And then finally, this one's also really awesome, the who, what, why. I'm not going to go into that in this video, but it's a really deep point of bookcraft, which I think is useful if you understand how it works. kind of like the main themes you should be focused on in each quarter of your novel. I've got some scene checklists that you can use to further refine, making sure that every scene and every chapter is really good. There's a lot of stuff on this page because I've been updating it for years because it gets a lot of traffic. And then finally, down here, I've got a course which I think is still at $37, but I need to raise the price because it's a really in-depth course and most people are charging a lot more money for writing courses. And I also tried to put all of this stuff together into a much deeper book on bookcraft, which is not terrible with a 4.4 review, but has gotten some negative reviews because I tried a little too hard to incorporate personal story to get readers to draw into the narrative a little more. So a lot of people have said, there's too much fluff, there's too much other stuff. I just want to get to the basics. If you're looking for, the simple, clean information, then I'd stick with the free stuff that's on Creativity or all the free videos on YouTube. There's a lot. Or my writing course, which is a pretty good deal and has everything organized. If you want to really understand a very deep perspective of how all this stuff works, if you really focus on improving your craft, I do think this book is worth it because I've really gone deeper on trying to explain all the things, and I keep things a little bit simpler on the free materials and on YouTube. But that's basically it. Let me know if you have any questions. I'm going to start making some new content for YouTube because a lot of my stuff is a little bit older now, and I'd like to refresh things a bit. So make sure you like and subscribe if this video was helpful or useful to you, and let me know what other questions you have about writing. I'd like to be doing more videos about specific writing problems or issues to help writers develop their craft to a deeper level. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.